Okay, so the title of this one is 50 Years of Domino Legislation, basically looking at the idea of how you can get one domino to tip over a bunch more dominoes. And this is in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. So basically how one congressman's vote can influence all the votes of those behind him. And if this congressman starts to notice that his vote is influencing all the votes of all these others that fall behind him, well, then he starts to get this idea that he or she might be a king. Right? We've given them enormous amounts of power. Whenever they vote, all these people behind them are likely to vote for that legislation as well. And what happens whenever you give someone an inordinate amount of power is, well, we open up chances for abuse of power. And this leads to very interesting scenarios whereby you might only need to have an arrangement with one particular congressman to pass legislation that you want. And what's even more unusual and more painful about this is, because of torpedo amendments, which I talk about in another video, it is conceivable to end up passing legislation that no one wants. And I'm talking no one. No outside group, no congressman, nobody. Okay, so torpedo amendments are things that were basically just proposed to tear down one particular congressman. And because of this domino concept that happens inside of Congress, some of those terrible bills, which were never assumed to pass and no one cared whether they passed or not, some of these could accidentally pass. And we certainly see evidence that other people are aware of this, because as soon as a congressman goes from being just a run-of-the-mill congressman to becoming a chairman, especially if they're chairman of some of the big committees which talk about taxes, like the Ways and Means Committee, or finance or budgeting or something like that, anything to do with money, as soon as they become chairman, all of a sudden, all the lobby groups are interested in them and start donating to their campaign. It's not like suddenly they're reaching out harder to those lobbyists. These lobbyists immediately give them way more. So if you are a chairman, you are almost always to make way more money in donations than anybody else. Or if you're a speaker, or if you're a whip, especially the majority whip, these folks make donations. And as soon as they lose their chairmanship, their donations go down. And as soon as some no-name, no donation-making representative becomes a chairman, well, all of a sudden they get tons and tons of donations. So lobbyists are very aware of this domino effect, because this domino effect relies highly on leaders inside of Congress. So people who have the ability to control power inside of Congress. And I've mentioned before that lobbyists and outside groups are some of the main influencers of congressmen. And I'm going to modify that a little bit. It might be possible that the main influence of congressmen are other congressmen. So congressmen are worried about their jobs, but they're also worried about getting chairmanships and other things and passing legislation. And so the people that scare them the most might just be other congressmen. And Kingdon, in his 1973 book, even mentions this. He says that congressmen, in their conversations, the word counts usually referred to their worries concerning mostly about other congressmen, and number 2 was constituents. And then maybe 3, 4, and 5 would be lobbyists, but certainly lobbyist groups have gone up over time. But it's very important to realize that congressmen are very dangerous to other congressmen. So I'm going to flip through some pictures and start to discuss this idea. It's going to be a little bit random, but I just want to get this idea out there. Okay, so here's a great quote from one of the big textbooks on Congress. Here's Davidson and Olasek and Schickler and all these great folks, right? And they have this quote right in the middle of their textbook. And this is a quote from a representative. And this member of Congress says, "I find that a lot of times people walk into the chamber where they're going to vote or discuss legislation, and the first thing they do is look at the board. What's this board? It blew my mind that I had never seen this board before in any photo, because whenever we look at Congress, we see photos that look like this. And here's all the members in there, and they might even be listening to the president or John Boehner. And here's where they vote. They have these little voting machines sitting underneath here. And when they vote, there's usually just a mass of people sitting in the aisles and standing around and talking about the legislation. But this is the way that Congress looks most of the time. But when they vote, it changes. These brocade-looking cloth things, or whatever they are, suddenly turn into jumbotrons. And so when they're voting, Congress looks like this. So here's members who are voting or talking about a vote, but all of a sudden, every single member's name appears on these electronic boards. And as soon as they vote, their name gets tagged with whether they voted for or against. Okay, so this is ultra transparency. And as soon as the vote is done, this is broadcast on tons of websites. But it's really important to realize that while they're voting, you have congressmen like this one right here looking up at the board, and they're waiting to see how other congressmen are going to vote. Okay, so let's go back to this quote. I find that a lot of times people, members, House of Representative members, walk into Congress, into the chamber, And the first thing they do is look at the board. They look to see how people are voting. And they have key people they check out. And if those people have voted A for yes, they go to the machine and they vote A. They vote the same way these key people have voted. And there is an official term for this. It's called cue taking. They're taking their cue from other members of Congress. I'm also referring to this as dominoes. Okay, so they're looking at key people. These key people may have been the people who wrote the bill. They may know more about it, agricultural stuff, or they may be people that have power inside the House and are scaring these underlings who might come in and vote. These are people who will decide if they become chairman themselves, if they get to be cue givers. And as David King says, the cue givers decide 90% of all legislation. This is massive stuff, and this was changed dramatically with the Legislative Reorganization Act because it allowed for transparent voting. It was very hard to be a cue giver and apply your pressure if you couldn't tell how the other members voted. Okay, so let's continue with this amazing quote. So, they have key people they check out. Leaders, influential people, smart people, but often people who have lots of power. And if those people have voted yes, they go to the machine and they voted yes, and they walk off the floor. But I will look at the board and see how members of the state delegation vote because they are in districts right next to me. Okay, so this guy's saying he's influenced by the other congressman in his state. Now remember, almost no congressman is going to tell you they're being bossed about. Kingdon talks about this. How many members are going to tell you they're being pushed about or afraid of other members in the way they vote? They're always going to rationalize it with something that makes logical sense. So this guy's rationalizing right here. He's saying, I have no fear. I'm not afraid of any congressman. I just go and look at how the other congressmen in districts right next to me voted, and I see that they have constituencies just like mine, and I'll vote the way I am going to vote, except that if they are all different. And I will go up and ask. I'm going to go and use my logic. Now, we know that lots of congressmen don't do this. They actually just cue take without thinking at all and without asking any questions. And we've seen this now a lot in the data from the Senate. And we see a lot of these big cue givers making sure that they're voting early. So if you want to make sure that your domino effect works, you've got to be one of the first people voting. And we see this a lot on important bills and things that matter to them. They run out and vote early. And if you don't vote with them, there's hell to pay. And so this is intimidation that takes place implicitly. You don't even have to talk about it. But 3 months from now, 2 years from now, the cue giver can look back and see how many times you voted with them and how many times you voted against them, and they will decide whether they're going to give you a better job in Congress or support your next candidacy or anything that matters. So all of a sudden, everything that matters in the future relies on how much cue taking you are doing. And we see examples of this in the literature everywhere, but sometimes they say it way too clearly for comfort. So here's Barney Frank, who is, for most parts, a cue giver because he was a big player in the House of Representatives and he sat as chairman on some big committees. Okay, but here he is saying, be ready to give in on unimportant issues. Give in means voting the way that someone else has decided to vote. So remember, if you're not transparent, you would just vote against something you didn't like or didn't understand. And it's really key when we talk about not understanding. If you don't understand something, it's very, very important for a congressman who doesn't understand something to vote against it. Because if you don't vote against it, you have no idea what sort of implications will happen with this legislation, especially when it comes to taxation, which is where the most complicated amendments get written. Okay, so here's Barney Frank saying again, be ready to give in. Vote in the way other people want you to on unimportant issues. I would regularly have the situation where we would be proposing a piece of legislation and someone would say, I want to add this one amendment. My staff, being very sensible, intelligent people, would say, well, that amendment doesn't really do anything. You don't need it. So before 1970, every congressman would vote against it. You would say no immediately because it doesn't make any sense. It's confusing. We don't really see what its purpose serves. But now, since 1970, and I spoke to Barney Frank personally, he has no recollection of the Legislative Reorganization Act at all. He says that his answer would be, well, if it doesn't do any harm, and how can you tell? Because as we'll see later, congressmen have no idea if legislation is going to do harm because they weren't the ones to write that. And a lot of these amendments were written in coded, super coded language just to help out one specific special interest. And they write it in this really boring way so it seems innocuous. But his answer would be, well, if it doesn't do any harm, we will accept it. We're going to vote for something we don't understand or don't really like because voting is transparent and because we're trading votes here. And you can only really be trading votes if there's transparency. So all this horse trading we talk about in Congress really only happens if you have transparency. Otherwise, you just vote against it because it's crap. Leadership is in a very much reciprocal situation. He's a leader. Having the power to command people is of very limited use if you don't make good relationships. That's especially true when you're in a legislative leadership position, because no member can order anybody else to vote a certain way. All you can do is put it in their interest. You can pressure them. You could tell them you won't give them a job. You could imply that. And look at the title of this article. And if you watch this video, Barney Frank is talking heavily about the powers of intimidation and pressuring people to get them to vote in your direction. And as soon as a congressman is voting in your direction, that means you remove the vote of all 700,000 of that congressperson's constituents. So constituents lose when one congressman can pressure another. And so as we've already discussed, what happens is one of the big chairmen walks in. He's got powers to control so many other congressmen, and he's respected because he's worked hard on that particular committee. And if you go against him, they'll be held to pay. And they walk in on anything important for them, they vote early. And if you don't follow with the way they vote, there's hell to pay. This is intimidation, this is bribery, it's whatever you want to call it, but this is corruption. And this cannot happen if the votes are secret. So let's look at this last little quote right here, and this is very important. It says that roll call votes can be useful to examine certain aspects of legislative behavior, though we don't know what aspects we're measuring. But what we've certainly seen since amendments have been transparent is enormous polarization. And polarization means that usually you have the entire party voting the same way. 240 votes for an amendment and 0 against. When you have 244 and 0 against for amendment after amendment after amendment after amendment, as you did in the 104th Congress under Tom DeLay, who was the Speaker of the House and he was known for intimidation, then you have voter fraud. This is voter fraud inside of our legislature. You never have this level of unanimity when you have secret ballots. So scholars who choose to use roll call voting on the basis of their studies, however, must consider how electronic voting, open voting, has changed member behavior. Prior to 1973, there were no electronic boards with every congressman's name and every congressman's vote right there. The way they voted was secret. Prior to 1973, members were at the mercy of party leadership, the media, and their own observations when determining how other members were voting, which means they didn't know how other members were voting because the party leadership, the media, and their own observations weren't always reliable, very hard to count everybody, very hard to see them talk to all the parliamentarians and all the clerks as they're voting. And it's very hard to look back through history and see all the percentages of how much someone has voted for you and someone has voted against you on all the particular amendments, because it was all secret. It wasn't on any list. Today, all a member has to do is look up at the display boards or read all the votes from the past decade, because they're all printed, and see what colored dot appears next to their colleague's name. Green for aye, red for nay, yellow if you're a yellow jacket, which usually means you're going to vote at the last second because you're being bribed, intimidated, or extorting somebody, and see what color dot appears next to their colleague's name. The increase in information available in real time to members has undoubtedly changed voting strategies. It's undoubtedly changed the way they vote. It's undoubtedly changed legislation. And what you have now is massive power inside of committee chairs, and they go in and vote, and everybody falls behind them. You have dominoes. And this is a power that this committee chair can sell or make relationships with lobbyists and virtually guarantee. When Tom DeLay was Speaker of the House, over 80% of the votes went in the way that he decided. How powerful is that when he's talking to a lobbyist? You can say, man, I can get any amendment in there. The more confusing and the more innocuous you make your amendment look, the more likely I will guarantee that we're going to get 240 Republican votes for it and 0 against. This is domino voting. This can only happen if you have transparency, and this started in the early 1970s.